This is World Civilization. My name is Dr. Long. This video is entitled Capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system in which property is owned privately, either by an individual, business partners, or corporation. Property in a capitalist system is the means of production needed to make goods, such as a factory. Now, capital itself is the money or credit needed to start or expand a business. In a capitalist system, people produce goods and provide services for money. Thus, what motivates people is profit. Goods and services are bought and sold freely. Another term for capitalism is the free market economy. In a capitalist or free market economy, the price of goods and services is set by the market, according to supply and demand. If a good or service is in high demand, the price goes up. If it is not in high demand, the price falls. Certainly, capitalism is not entirely a modern concept. Many pre-modern civilizations engaged in extensive production and trade of goods, including over long distances. However, since the Industrial Revolution in the 1780s, the modern industrial capitalist economy has come to include large financial markets, banking, stocks, bonds, insurance, and other. Financial markets have facilitated the growth of large corporations on the scale that humanity has not seen since the 1780s. It has also allowed for individuals at the top of the capitalist economy to become wealthy on a level never seen before as well. Now, a few figures have made important contributions about how people think about capitalism in the modern world. The first is the Scottish moral philosopher Adam Smith, who lived from 1723 to 1790. Smith taught at Glasgow University, and he was one of the most important thinkers in what has been called the Scottish Enlightenment. While Smith was a philosopher, his ideas were most applied to economics. Smith's most famous book is entitled The Wealth of Nations, which he published in 1776, just before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. As a theorist, Adam Smith is typically considered the father of modern capitalism, and his book, The Wealth of Nations, is considered one of the greatest works to deal with capitalism. Now, as an Enlightenment philosopher, Adam Smith was very critical of the mercantilism system. Mercantilism was the economic system that dominated in Europe from the 16th to the 18th century. And the idea of mercantilism is that government should promote the interest of merchants and take measures to expand their own nation's trade. So it's one very focused on your own nation, and it sees the economy as a zero-sum game. And if France benefits, then Britain does not, and so forth. So mercantilism included tariffs, placing goods on foreign goods to prevent foreign goods from competing with goods produced domestically. It also included policies that require colonies to trade with their mother country, with the idea that they should provide their mother country raw materials and only purchase finished goods from merchants in the mother country. Smith was very critical of mercantilism as inefficient and unfree. He also saw it as necessitating too much government interference in the marketplace to enforce all of these mechanisms, tariffs and trade only with the mother country. Instead, Smith advocated as little government interference as possible in the market, a concept known as laissez-faire capitalism. This is sometimes called classical liberalism, where the government interferes as little as possible in the economy. Smith was not an anarchist, certainly. He did think that government had a role to play in the economy. He was not against government per se. However, he saw government less as deciding winners and losers, but more as a referee. Government in Smith's view, is to ensure fairness, enforcing business contracts and basic law. For Smith, what really decides the market is what he called the invisible hand, that the market would work out problems that arise in the system over time on its own through free exchanges of goods and services among peoples. In other words, if allowed to run their own affairs, people would sort out their own problems over time without the government, and supply and demand will determine production and price, not government mandates. Smith was also an advocate of free trade. In The Wealth of Nations, he argued that free trade allowed countries to specialize and to concentrate their production of goods on products that come most natural to them and that they are good at producing. Smith gave the example of wine. He noted that Scotland, his own native country, was too cold and wet to grow grapes to make wine, while France, on the other hand, has a much better climate for wine growing. Smith wrote that tariffs would not help Scotland to have a wine industry because its climate didn't permit it. And instead, Scotland should simply freely import wine from France without posing tariffs on them. Scottish people could then concentrate on making other things to sell to France. Smith also wrote about how factories operated, including important concepts such as the division of labor and economies of scale. Now, another important economist of capitalism was Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter lived from 1883 to 1950. And he is known for the concept of what is called creative destruction. And this concept of creative destruction is very important to understanding how modern capitalism works. Schumpeter was very interested in innovation in a capitalist system. Capitalism promotes innovation because of the profit motive. But for Schumpeter, every time there was innovation, it led to the destruction of certain businesses that already existed. In other words, in the modern industrial capitalism, businesses that invent or come up with new goods and services that the public wants and they previously didn't have access to will lead to squeezing out of businesses that already exist. Schumpeter saw the constant rise and fall of businesses as part and parcel of the modern capitalist system. And for him, this is called creative destruction. A good example of the whole process of creative destruction that you may be familiar with is the example of Blockbuster Video. During the 1980s and 1990s, people who watched videos at home watched them on VCRs or DVD players. It became very popular to rent movies, to watch them at home, and to return the tape or DVD to rental stores. Blockbuster Video was founded in 1985 as a video rental store. And it quickly took off and became very popular and a major national rental store chain. At its height in 2004, Blockbuster Video had over 60,000 employees and over 9,000 stores with annual revenue of $5.9 billion. Then, technology changed, allowing people to stream movies to the internet to their computer, phone, or television. Companies such as Netflix, founded in 1997, or Hulu, founded in 2007, quickly grew to provide streaming services that did not require the thousands of stores that Blockbuster had. With streaming services, fewer and fewer people wanted to rent movies anymore. The new streaming technology led to strong growth for Netflix and Hulu, but it absolutely devastated a rental company like Blockbuster. Blockbuster went from a multi-billion-dollar company in 2004 to bankruptcy and liquidation in 2013. So I'm giving you this example because Blockbuster's rise and fall due to new technology is a great example of this whole process of creative destruction, where innovation leads to the rise of some companies and the destruction of others. And this creative innovation is creative, but again, it's destructive as well. And Schumpeter explains this at great length. So he's important. Schumpeter is an important theorist in this regard. Another feature of capitalism, and Schumpeter talks about this, as do other economists, is the whole boom and bust cycle. And this is very prominent in modern industrial capitalism. It is when this whole boom and bust cycle is when the economy booms with a new innovation or product, but eventually will overheat due to overspeculation in financial markets or overproduction, and then the market will crash, which is known as a bust. And this cycle endlessly repeats itself. Now, modern industrial capitalism certainly has its problems. It's often featured the poor treatment of workers, particularly during the early decades of industrialization, and even today in developing countries seeking to industrialize. This includes long hours, poor wages, terrible conditions for workers, vast inequalities between workers and the owners and managers. Pollution of the environment is another part of modern industrial capitalism. And also, it's worth noting that while Adam Smith's ideas explain how a free market system should work in theory, capitalists in reality are a lot more interested in profits than ensuring that the market is truly a free market. In other words, many capitalists, if they can game the system, are quite happy to do so if it increases their profit margin, whether it's fair or not. This means that modern capitalist economies often include individuals in business who engage in what economists call rent-seeking. Rent-seeking involves individuals or companies who seek to convince the government to alter policies to benefit them. But for the market as a whole, these policies are often inefficient. As an example of this is a company that convinces the government to impose a tariff on a foreign good to choke out competitors. Another example would be a company that convinces the government to impose a regulation on a product that strictly speaking is not necessary, but would prevent them from having new competitors enter the market and would force them to compete. One might call the multi-billion-dollar federal government's bailout of the big banks who took out bad mortgage loans following the 2008 economic crash as a form of rent-seeking as well. Another term for rent-seeking is crony capitalism. In addition to rent-seeking activities, companies are often quite happy, if the law permits, to form monopolies. A monopoly is when one company has control of the entire market of a specific good or product, with no competition or little competition. This allows them basically to set prices and to treat customers as they wish. Again, Smith's theory of the free market would exclude practices such as rent-seeking and monopolies. But in reality, individuals and companies have done it since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, if and when they can get away with it, because these practices are often quite highly profitable. Capitalism's problems have led to the rise of many critics. The foremost critic of capitalism, of course, was Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883. Marx, of course, saw history as driven by class conflict. He believed that capitalism had many internal contradictions, and he argued that the fierce competition inherent in the capitalist system, and he's certainly correct that the capitalist system is fiercely competitive, he argued that fierce competition would inevitably lead to greater and greater concentrations of wealth. This would make workers poorer and poorer. As their conditions increasingly worsen and they gain class consciousness, they would join unions and socialist parties. And capitalism, in Marx's view, would ultimately reach a stage of crisis in which workers stage a violent revolution and overthrow it, establishing a socialist state in which the state would own the means of production and run them on behalf of the workers. And eventually the socialist state would wither away with a pure communist society with all goods held in common, a classless utopia. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Marx's ideas inspired socialist parties in the West, as well as a series of international socialist meetings called the Socialist International. Now, socialists all over the Western world split in 1917 with the Russian Revolution. Some socialists backed Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and they would end up becoming known as communists. Others favored more democratic parties, social democratic parties, who thought Marx's revolution could be implemented peacefully through democratic change. This is also called revisionist socialism. Now, arguably, Marx was better at critiquing capitalism than proposing solutions, because as we know, communism was a disaster as a system. Still, both socialist and communist parties were very important critics of the capitalist system in the 20th century. Also, in the United States, the progressive movement in the late 19th and 20th centuries sought to clean up political corruption and often associated with big corporations. They also wanted to end monopolies and improve conditions for workers. Now, unlike Marxists, American progressives did not want to overthrow capitalism. However, they did seek to reform it. In Europe, on the other hand, in the late 19th and 20th centuries, there were also critics of capitalism who did not seek to overthrow it, but who sought to reform it. For instance, Catholic and Protestant churches often came to favor parties known as Christian Democrats. And Christian Democrats became important political parties in countries such as the Netherlands, Germany, France, and Italy. Christian democratic parties favored democracy in politics and certainly were influenced by Christian ideas. They were inspired by Christian social teachings. For example, Pope Leo's 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was supportive of unions and critical of the abuse of workers. Also, the writings of Dutch Protestant theologian and politician, and he briefly served as the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Abraham Kuyper, who lived from 1837 to 1920. Kuyper called for a form of Christian socialism. He was very critical of cutthroat capitalism and the abuse of workers. While he was not out to overthrow the capitalist system, he certainly thought the government should take necessary reforms to make it easier and better for workers. Now, whether Catholic or Protestant, Christian Democrats were critical of capitalism and sought to improve the lot of workers and to curb the excesses of the capitalist system. In Western democracies in the 20th century, people such as social democrats, who favored socialism on a more democratic level, Christian Democrats, and progressives in the United States successfully pushed for reforms of the capitalist system. This included better pay and conditions for workers, as well as the expansion of what has been called the welfare state. Now, the welfare state does not refer simply to welfare as we often think of it in the United States. Rather, the welfare state refers to the benefits that the state provides to people, such as unemployment, disability payments, health care, child care, retirement, and so forth. Welfare state is paid for by taxes. And in the 20th century and early 21st century, the welfare state has greatly improved the lives of many working class and middle class people. It's helped in many ways to take the rough edges off of the capitalist system that is known for fierce competition and not a lot of concern for workers. You know, the downsides of capitalism in many ways have been mitigated by the welfare system that provides a safety net for people that fall between the cracks. Also, in industrialized countries such as Western nations and Japan, the welfare state, particularly in the Cold War, made communism largely unattractive, as it makes the critics of capitalism and their desire to overthrow it, particularly communist desire to overthrow capitalism, as unnecessary. After all, if you're a worker and you have retirement, unemployment, disability, those things that you can count on in a downtime, well, communism overthrowing the whole system seems a bit much. Capitalism as it developed in the West and Japan has also spread around the world in the 20th and 21st centuries and is now a global phenomenon. Developing countries, those currently industrializing, face the same issues and problems that the Western world did with the rise of industrial capitalism in the 19th century. However, since the collapse of communism in Europe in 1989 and the shift of communist nations in Asia, such as China and Vietnam, towards a more capitalist economy, capitalism now has no major rivals and is the dominant economic system in the world. Well, let's draw a few conclusions. The modern economy is largely a capitalist economy. As such, capitalism has come to define much of modern life, including economics, of course, but also has greatly influenced even social relations and politics. Capitalism has led to much economic growth and a lot of innovation since the 18th century due to competition. This innovation benefits consumers with new products and new services and a great deal of choice in the market. But the innovation of capitalist economies leads to dizzying rates of change and often to creative destruction, as Joseph Schumpeter put it. Also, the excesses of capitalism have caused a lot of problems, especially for workers. And if allowed, big corporations certainly do not hesitate to distort the market to their own advantage through rent-seeking and monopolistic practices. Still, despite the rapid rate of change that it has brought, and both for good or ill, capitalism has endured and adapted, for instance with the welfare state. While we can't know the future, it certainly does not appear that the main alternative to capitalism in the 20th century, namely communism, will make a comeback anytime soon. For better or for worse, capitalism seems here to stay. To use a description that Winston Churchill gave for democracy, Perhaps capitalism is the worst of all economic systems, except for all the rest. I'll stop with that observation. Thanks for watching.